What happens when the most powerful empire on earth suddenly stumbles in a place it thought it could never lose? My friends, today, the clash between the United States and Venezuela has produced a shock. Donald Trump, once the symbol of American strength abroad, now finds himself defeated, and America stands visibly on the back foot. For decades, Washington projected itself as the global enforcer, dictating policies, orchestrating sanctions, and deciding who leads and who falls. Yet here we are in 2025, watching a Latin American nation long targeted by U.S. pressure not only resist but humiliate the very leadership that promised America first. For most of the last century, the United States has carried itself with the aura of invincibility. It emerged from World War II as the world's largest economy, the architect of global financial institutions, the military giant with bases scattered across continents, and the nation whose political will could often determine the fates of governments in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The label of superpower was not just descriptive, it was an identity reinforced through decades of military interventions, covert operations, sanctions, and a cultural dominance that projected American strength into every corner of the world. Against that backdrop, the image of the United States stumbling, losing political ground, and facing humiliation in Venezuela is more than just another international incident. It strikes at the core of what America has long told itself and the rest of the world that it does not lose, certainly not to smaller nations in its own hemisphere. The defeat of Donald Trump in the Venezuelan clash is emblematic of this stumble. Trump, like many American presidents before him, attempted to assert U.S. dominance over Venezuela, deploying the familiar tools of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and pressure for regime change. For decades, these strategies worked against governments that refused to fall in line with Washington's directives. But this time, the calculus did not yield the expected results. Instead of bending, Venezuela pushed back, stood its ground, and in doing so delivered a symbolic blow to the U.S. posture of unquestioned authority. The American superpower met resistance and, rather than crushing it, found itself humbled, its political leadership visibly on the defensive. This stumble matters because it reveals something larger than the failure of a single administration. It exposes the limits of U.S. influence in the 21st century. The unipolar moment of the 1990s, when Washington enjoyed almost complete global dominance after the fall of the Soviet Union, is increasingly a distant memory. Rising powers like China and Russia, regional players like Iran and Turkey, and even smaller nations like Venezuela are learning that American threats no longer carry the same weight they once did. What unfolded in Venezuela is part of this wider pattern? The United States attempting to project force and shape outcomes, only to discover that the balance of global power has shifted enough to make resistance possible, even successful. The stumble is also deeply psychological. Superpowers maintain authority not only through raw force but also through perception. For decades, countries complied with U.S. demands not simply because of fear of punishment, but because of the widespread assumption that defiance was futile. To stand against Washington was to invite economic ruin, political isolation, or even military intervention that could not be resisted. That assumption gave the U.S. enormous leverage. What happens when that assumption begins to crack? The Venezuelan episode represents precisely such a crack, a visible demonstration that the United States can be resisted, that its will is not inevitable, that even a nation under heavy sanctions can withstand its pressure. The symbolic power of that moment reverberates far beyond Caracas. Another dimension of the stumble lies in domestic perception within the United States. Leaders from both political parties have long relied on projecting foreign victories as a way of reinforcing legitimacy at home. For Trump, who built much of his rhetoric around the promise of winning for America, a public defeat in Venezuela becomes especially damning. It undercuts the image he cultivated of strength and control, revealing instead vulnerability and failure. That political damage compounds the international embarrassment, showing allies and adversaries alike that American leadership is not as stable or unstoppable as once assumed. Economically, the stumble underscores the declining effectiveness of sanctions as a weapon. For years, Washington relied on its control over the global financial system to choke economies into submission. Yet Venezuela's survival despite crippling sanctions demonstrates both the ingenuity of nations under pressure and the growing willingness of other global players to help them bypass American restrictions. This not only weakens the immediate impact of U.S. tactics, but also signals to the world that there are alternatives to American dominance of global trade and finance. The cultural image of the U.S. also takes a hit. In Latin America, where resentment of American interference has simmered for decades, the sight of Washington failing against Venezuela will resonate deeply. It confirms the narrative that U.S. power is not invincible, that the hemisphere no longer belongs unchallenged to Washington's dictates. For ordinary people across the globe, especially in regions accustomed to living under the shadow of American intervention, this stumble becomes a moment of inspiration, a reminder that empires do not last forever, and that the arc of history can bend in unexpected directions. The defeat of Trump in the Venezuelan clash is not just about one man's failure to achieve his foreign policy objectives. It is about something larger, more profound, and more troubling for the United States as a whole, the symbolic decline of American power in a region it has long considered its own backyard. Latin America has for over a century been the testing ground for Washington's dominance. From the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century to the Cold War interventions of the 20th, the United States treated Latin America as a sphere where no rival power should be allowed to operate and no government should be allowed to challenge American authority. This attitude produced a long history of interventions, coups, sanctions, and puppet regimes installed or supported by Washington. The message was clear. Resistance in the Western Hemisphere was not tolerated. Against that backdrop, what happened in Venezuela represents not just a local setback, but a direct challenge to the image of American supremacy. For decades, Washington succeeded in imposing its will in the region. When governments drifted left or attempted policies that clashed with U.S. corporate or geopolitical interests, they were either overthrown or brought to heel. Trump entered this tradition with full confidence that by exerting economic and political pressure, he could force Venezuela into submission, topple its leadership, and reassert U.S. control. Instead, Venezuela stood its ground, refused to bound, and exposed the limits of American power. This outcome is symbolically powerful because it shows the erosion of the United States' ability to maintain uncontested influence in a place it once regarded as untouchable. The symbolic decline is magnified by the historical context. During the Cold War, Washington justified its interventions by pointing to the Soviet threat. Any left-leaning government in Latin America was portrayed as a potential ally of Moscow, and this narrative provided political cover for aggressive U.S. policies. Today, however, there is no Soviet Union. The United States is supposedly the dominant superpower, yet even in this moment of supposed supremacy, it could not impose its will on Venezuela? That contradiction is glaring. If the United States cannot secure its dominance in its own hemisphere, in a country it has sanctioned, isolated, and threatened for years, what does that say about its capacity to dominate more distant regions where the stakes and resistance are even higher? The symbolism here matters more than the practical outcomes of any one clash. It is a marker of decline, a reminder that empires lose power first at the margins, then at the core. Another layer of symbolic decline is how this defeat is perceived by allies and rivals alike. For allies in Latin America who have long balanced their policies between compliance with Washington and service to their own populations, Venezuela's resistance creates a dangerous precedent from Washington's perspective. It tells them that defiance is possible, that U.S. pressure is not insurmountable, and that the costs of resistance may be worth bearing. For rivals such as China and Russia, the Venezuelan outcome is a demonstration that America's grip is loosening and opportunities exist to expand influence where once it was impossible. Already, both Moscow and Beijing have increased their presence in Latin America, filling spaces left open by Washington's declining authority. The symbolism of America's inability to stop this trend is as powerful as the reality itself. The domestic symbolism is equally important. For decades, Americans were told that their government maintained order abroad, that it could dictate terms to weaker nations, and that U.S. leadership was the foundation of global stability. Watching a relatively small and impoverished country like Venezuela stand firm and hand Washington a defeat undermines that narrative. It raises questions at home about whether American leaders, no matter how forceful their rhetoric, truly have the power to deliver victories. For Trump in particular, who built his image on the promise of strength, winning, and making America feared and respected again, such a visible defeat cuts deep. It chips away at the mythology that U.S. presidents can always bend smaller nations to their will. The symbolic decline also touches on the broader international order. America's image as the global policeman relied heavily on its ability to dominate nearby regions with ease. Latin America was the showcase of this dominance, the place where the United States could always point and say, "Here is proof that our power is unmatched." The failure in Venezuela tarnishes that showcase. It reveals cracks in the edifice of control and invites further challenges. Symbolism in geopolitics often matters as much as material realities. Once the aura of invincibility is punctured, the decline can accelerate quickly. quickly as other states test the limits and realize the empire is not as strong as it once appeared. For much of the modern era, the United States has relied on a familiar set of instruments to project its power abroad: economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, threats of military action, and covert or overt regime change operations. These tools, refined through the Cold War and aggressively deployed in the decades since, became the backbone of U.S. foreign policy. They were considered reliable, even predictable, in producing outcomes favorable to Washington. When governments refused to comply with U.S. demands, sanctions would strangle their economies, destabilization campaigns would weaken their leadership, and if all else failed, military intervention would impose a new order. The Venezuelan episode reveals how these tools, once effective, are no longer delivering the desired results, marking a dramatic shift in the landscape of global power. Sanctions were perhaps the most heavily used weapon against Venezuela. The United States, leveraging its dominance over the global financial system, cut the country off from international markets, froze assets abroad, and sought to cripple its oil industry, the backbone of Venezuela's economy. The assumption was that economic suffocation would either force the government to capitulate or drive its population to overthrow it. Yet, despite years of intense sanctions, Venezuela endured. It reorganized parts of its economy, turned to barter arrangements, leaned on allies like Russia, China, and Iran for support, and cultivated networks that bypassed American financial choke points. The survival of the Venezuelan state under these conditions is a testament to the diminishing effectiveness of sanctions as a unilateral tool. Once feared as a death sentence for smaller nations, sanctions are now being resisted and in some cases adapted to in ways that blunt their impact. The reliance on threats of military intervention also failed to achieve its intended effect. U.S. officials spoke openly about the possibility of military action attempting to intimidate Venezuelan leaders into submission. Historically, the shadow of American military power was enough to force concessions. From Central America to the Caribbean, the threat of Marines landing or airstrikes targeting capitals had compelled governments to reconsider their stance. But in this case, Venezuela, backed indirectly by international rivals and buoyed by a population hardened by years of struggle, did not fold. The U.S. discovered that the credibility of its threats is not what it once was. The endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the fiasco of Libya, and the reluctance of the American public to support new foreign entanglements have all undermined the intimidation factor of U.S. military warnings. Leaders abroad increasingly sense that Washington talks tough but lacks the political will to follow through, and this realization weakens one of its most important instruments of control. Regime change tactics, long a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, also faltered. The attempt to elevate Juan Guaido as the recognized president of Venezuela, complete with backing from American allies, was supposed to be a masterstroke. By recognizing an alternative leader and supporting opposition movements, the U.S. hoped to delegitimize the sitting government and bring about a transition without direct military involvement. Yet this effort collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Guaido failed to consolidate power, the opposition fractured, and the Venezuelan state remained intact. What was once a tried and true tactic, propping up a compliant alternative to engineer regime change, was exposed as hollow, ineffective, and, in this case, almost farcical. The failure of these tools does not just represent a tactical miscalculation, it signals a structural decline in U.S. dominance. These instruments worked when America controlled not only the world's military and financial systems, but also the global narrative. Nations facing U.S. pressure often complied because they lacked alternatives. Today, alternatives exist. The rise of China as a trading partner, Russia as a military backer, and regional alliances that create mutual support networks have diluted Washington's capacity to isolate countries. Global communication networks allow leaders targeted by the U.S. to tell their side of the story, undermining propaganda campaigns that once justified interventions. The world is not unipolar anymore, and the toolbox of sanctions, threats, and regime change tactics is no longer decisive. What Venezuela demonstrates is not simply the resilience of one country, but the erosion of Washington's ability to use its once reliable weapons to maintain global order. The failure of these strategies sends a signal across the globe that U.S. pressure can be resisted and survived. It shows that the fear once associated with crossing Washington is fading, and with it, the capacity to dictate outcomes without resorting to far greater risks and costs than it has been willing to bear. The defiance of Venezuela against the immense pressure of the United States is one of the most striking developments in recent geopolitical history. For a country that is relatively small in population and far less wealthy than the global superpower confronting it, to survive years of sanctions, isolation, and political destabilization campaigns is remarkable in itself. But what makes this defiance even more significant is the symbolic power it projects to the rest of the world. It shows that resistance, once considered futile against Washington, is not only possible but can actually succeed. This outcome inspires not just Venezuela's immediate neighbors in Latin America, but governments and movements across the globe that have long felt suffocated under the weight of American dominance. Venezuela's resistance did not occur in a vacuum. The country has faced relentless attempts to undermine its political system, collapse its economy, and delegitimize its leadership. The United States cut it off from financial markets, froze its assets abroad, crippled its oil industry, and even recognized an alternative leader in an effort to dismantle the existing government. Historically, such a barrage of pressure would have been enough to break the resolve of a smaller state, yet Venezuela managed to survive, adapt, and continue functioning in the face of conditions that would have destroyed many other nations. This resilience in itself is a statement of defiance, a demonstration that sheer will, coupled with international partnerships and a determined population, can hold out against the might of a superpower. The impact of this defiance goes beyond the survival of Venezuela. It sends a message to other nations that the old rules of global politics are no longer absolute. Countries that once believed resistance to Washington was impossible can now look at Caracas and see a model, however imperfect, of endurance. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, governments that have faced U.S. sanctions or threats take note of Venezuela's ability to maintain sovereignty despite isolation. This does not mean every nation can replicate Venezuela's strategy, but it does mean the aura of inevitability around U.S. dominance is breaking. The symbolic importance of that shift is profound because once fear begins to erode, defiance becomes contagious. At the same time, Venezuela's resistance highlights the limitations of American influence in today's multipolar world. Caracas was able to lean on alternative global powers such as Russia, China, and Iran for support, whether through trade, financial arrangements, or energy cooperation. These partnerships provided lifelines that blunted the force of U.S. sanctions and allowed the country to survive. By refusing to give in, Venezuela not only preserved its sovereignty, but also accelerated the emergence of a world where smaller nations can resist by aligning with alternative centers of power. This creates ripple effects far beyond Latin America, as it shows that a nation under intense pressure can survive if it plays its cards strategically in the new geopolitical landscape. The defiance also carries immense psychological weight for populations around the world who have lived under the assumption that U.S. power is unchallengeable. For decades, people in Latin America, the Middle East, and beyond watched governments fall when Washington set its sights on regime change. The lesson was clear. Resistance leads to destruction. Venezuela's survival appends that lesson. It provides a counter-narrative, one in which determination and solidarity can outlast even the most punishing campaigns of economic warfare. That psychological shift cannot be underestimated because it emboldens both governments and grassroots movements to believe that the cost of standing up to American dictates may no longer be as absolute as once feared. What makes the Venezuelan case especially potent is the context of its poverty relative to the United States. Here is a nation with limited resources, a struggling economy, and enormous internal challenges, yet it stood firm against the richest and most militarily powerful country on earth. The symbolism of this dynamic matters as much as the material reality. It suggests that power is not purely about wealth or military hardware, but also about political will, endurance, and the ability to mobilize alternative networks of support. For countries across the globe that see themselves as too small or too weak to challenge great powers, Venezuela's defiance serves as an example that the balance of power is not set in stone and that even the giants of the world can be resisted when the conditions align. The defeat of the United States in its clash with Venezuela does not remain confined to the borders of that Latin American nation. Its ripples extend outward, creating a powerful global signal that has the potential to reshape international politics in ways Washington may not have anticipated. For decades, the assumption was simple: opposing the United States came at a cost too high for most countries to bear. Economic ruin, diplomatic isolation, or even military destruction were the expected outcomes of defiance. That expectation shaped the behavior of governments across continents, producing a world where compliance was the safer, more rational path, yet Venezuela's survival and its ability to resist U.S. power sends a very different message, that the costs of defiance may no longer be prohibitive, that smaller nations can carve out space for independence, and that Washington's dominance is not absolute. This global signal begins with perception, and perception in geopolitics often shapes reality. When leaders in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East watch Venezuela endure years of sanctions and political pressure without collapsing, they begin to reconsider their own strategies. If Venezuela, a country battered economically and painted as isolated, can survive, then perhaps resistance is not suicidal but viable. That perception alone alters calculations in capitals around the world. It emboldens governments to negotiate harder with Washington, to refuse demands they once would have accepted reluctantly, and to seek alternative alliances to reduce their vulnerability. The symbolic value of one nation's survival reverberates in the choices made by many others. The global signal also travels through the network of rival powers that have long sought to challenge U.S. hegemony. China and Russia in particular see Venezuela's defiance as evidence that the world is entering a more multipolar phase where American dominance can be checked. These powers are likely to point to Venezuela as proof that their support makes a difference, that U.S. sanctions can be bypassed, and that Washington no longer holds the monopoly on international legitimacy. This bolsters their efforts to build alternative institutions, from trade networks to financial systems designed to weaken U.S. leverage. The Venezuelan case thus becomes both a justification and an encouragement for the creation of parallel structures that accelerate the decline of unilateral American control. At the same time, the signal is received by populations as well as governments. Ordinary people across the world who have watched their nations bend under U.S. pressure may find inspiration in Venezuela's refusal to yield. In countries where anti-American sentiment is strong, this narrative becomes fuel for resistance movements, giving them a real-world example to point to when arguing against compliance. The psychological effect of seeing a smaller country withstand the weight of the superpower cannot be overstated. It shifts the discourse from resignation to possibility, from inevitability to contingency, and once people believe that domination is not permanent, the political landscape begins to change. The global signal also affects Washington's allies, who now must reconsider the reliability of American power. For decades, part of the incentive to align with the United States was the belief that it was an unbeatable guarantor of order, that its enemies always lost, and that its will would prevail. Venezuela's defiance challenges that belief. Allies may begin to hedge their bets, diversifying relationships to avoid being left exposed if American power continues to erode. The very perception that the U.S. can be resisted weakens its ability to command loyalty, making the web of alliances that underpins its global role more fragile. In practical terms, the Venezuelan example may embolden other sanctioned nations such as Iran or North Korea to hold their ground with greater confidence. It may encourage governments in Africa to resist U.S. dictates on resource management, or Southeast Asian countries to push back against American demands on trade and security. Even in Europe, where the alliance with the United States has historically been strongest, the awareness that Washington's power is not invulnerable may fuel debates over greater independence in foreign policy. The signal operates less as a set of instructions and more as an opening of political imagination. If Venezuela can resist, so can we, and if we can, then perhaps the world is not locked into the hierarchy it has endured for so long. What makes this signal particularly potent is that it arises not from a powerful rival defeating the United States in open confrontation, but from a smaller, weaker nation standing its ground. That fact alone makes the lesson accessible to countries across the spectrum of power. It is one thing for China or Russia to defy Washington, since they are recognized as near-peer competitors. It is another thing entirely for Venezuela, with far fewer resources, to endure without capitulation. That contrast makes the message stronger, more universal, and more threatening to U.S. dominance, because it undermines the idea that only the strongest can resist. It suggests that even the smaller states of the world can carve out independence if they are willing to endure the struggle, and that message is spreading faster than Washington can contain it. The image of the United States as the uncontested global leader has been a central feature of international politics since the end of the Second World War. For decades, Washington cultivated and projected an aura of inevitability, the sense that its leadership was not only dominant but unquestionable. It commanded military superiority, economic preeminence, cultural influence, and diplomatic weight in nearly every corner of the world. This leadership role was reinforced not only by America's vast resources but also by the perception that resistance was futile. Now, however, events such as the defeat in Venezuela make visible the erosion of that once unshakable image, exposing fractures that had been building for years and accelerating the sense that America's uncontested leadership belongs more to the past than the present. One of the clearest aspects of this erosion lies in credibility. Leadership is not simply about having power, but about convincing others to recognize and respect that power. The U.S. historically positioned itself as a model of strength, efficiency, and determination capable of shaping outcomes wherever it chose to intervene. Yet when a nation like Venezuela resists successfully, it punctures the mythology of invincibility that sustained American authority. Suddenly, the narrative of inevitability is questioned, and with it the aura of uncontested leadership. The world begins to see not a flawless enforcer of global order, but a country whose reach exceeds its grasp. That realization changes how others calculate their own policies, since American pressure no longer carries the same certainty of outcome. This erosion is compounded by the visible contradictions in U.S. foreign policy. Allies and adversaries alike notice the inconsistency between American claims to champion democracy and freedom while simultaneously supporting authoritarian regimes when convenient. For years, these contradictions could be overlooked because the sheer dominance of U.S. power made them irrelevant. Today, however, as Washington stumbles in regions where it once dictated terms, these hypocrisies become harder to ignore. When the U.S. fails to unseat governments it openly opposes, such as Venezuela, its double standards stand exposed without the protective shield of unquestioned authority. That exposure chips away at the moral legitimacy America once used to justify its leadership. The erosion of leadership is also visible in the growing willingness of countries to forge alternative paths that bypass Washington. Where once the United States dictated financial flows through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, nations increasingly seek support from China's Belt and Road Initiative or regional development banks. Where once U.S. sanctions could isolate a nation completely, today countries trade in alternative currencies, engage in barter systems, or align with powers willing to defy Washington's restrictions. Each of these moves reflects not only a material adjustment, but also a psychological one, the recognition that U.S. leadership is not indispensable. When smaller states begin to treat American dictates as optional rather than binding, the image of uncontested leadership deteriorates further. The domestic dimension of this erosion cannot be ignored. For decades, America's internal political stability and economic dynamism served as proof that it was uniquely suited to lead the world. The perception of a strong, united, and prosperous nation underpinned its global image. Yet the last 2 decades have exposed deep polarization, economic inequality, and governance crises that weaken the projection of American stability. When domestic dysfunction is broadcast globally, it undermines the argument that the U.S. embodies a model worth following. This erosion at home bleeds into the international sphere, where allies and rivals alike question whether Washington can sustain the leadership role it claims. Military supremacy, once the backbone of U.S. leadership, also shows signs of losing its deterrent aura. While the U.S. remains unmatched in raw capability, its inability to secure decisive victories in conflicts like Iraq, Afghanistan, and now its failures to impose outcomes in Venezuela signal that military might does not automatically translate into political success. This undermines one of the core assumptions of uncontested leadership, that America can and will shape outcomes wherever it chooses. The gap between capability and result weakens confidence in American power and accelerates the erosion of its leadership image. Even among allies, there is an increasing sense that Washington's leadership is conditional, fragile, and perhaps not permanent. European powers openly debate strategic autonomy, considering policies independent of American approval. Asian nations balance between U.S. and Chinese influence rather than aligning exclusively with Washington. Latin American countries, emboldened by Venezuela's resistance, question whether U.S. dominance is a relic of the past. Each of these shifts reflects not a total abandonment of the alliance system, but a recalibration of expectations, moving away from the notion of unquestioned American leadership toward a world where multiple poles of power coexist. The erosion of leadership is therefore not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process made visible by symbolic defeats. Venezuela's defiance is one such symbol, crystallizing broader doubts that had already been circulating. The uncontested status that Washington once enjoyed depended on a mixture of military dominance, economic control, ideological legitimacy, and global perception. As each of these foundations weakens, the image of America as the unchallenged leader of the world continues to slip, leaving behind a more fragmented and uncertain global order.